Good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to give a presentation on the authorisation requirements for foot and mouth disease vaccines in the EU. It's always a very difficult slot just before coffee and just after some very interesting talks on novel vaccines to give a regulatory talk, which tends to put the dampers on that enthusiasm. But what I intend to do is this morning just focus on some of the elements. I don't intend to focus on the quality areas, but a little bit on the safety and efficacy requirements if you were developing a live GMO vaccine for FMD in the European Union. So, before I start, I'm always interested in an R&D audience, how many people have heard of the European Medicines Agency. Could I just see a show of hands of who's heard of it? It's not bad. I would say about 40%. So what is the European Medicines Agency? It's an agency which is set up in 1995 in the European Union. It's responsible for the authorisation of human and animal products. It serves over 500 million people in the European Union and also those countries in the EEA, and is now responsible really for 20% of all sales of medicines both in Europe. And of interest to the veterinary sector, the European Medicines Agency draws on nearly 4,000 scientific experts through the network of regulatory agencies in the European Union. It has 7 scientific committees. 6 of those are human medicines, which probably tends to show the dominance of the human medicine in the European Union. But the Cvmp, or the Committee for Veterinary Medicinal Products, is the key committee for authorising veterinary medicines. And I think when we come on to authorising veterinary vaccines, FMD has to be probably the worst case scenario in terms of trying to address all the regulatory requirements. And then on top of that, making it a GMP, it's a really challenging environment. The resources, especially the financial resources as well, for addressing the regulatory requirements are immense. And any company who achieves an authorisation for foot and mouth has done a tremendous job, even for conventional products. I just put this up there. I saw this in the Animal Farm saying that GM technology is underused in animal health. Well, from a veterinary vaccine perspective, I'm not sure I would agree with that. I've listed here about 20 live GMO products authorised through the European Medicines Agency over the last 15, 20 years. This doesn't include the inactivated recombinants, only the live GMO. And you can see there's a sort of a relatively broad range of products for both companion and domestic animals. And also in the last year or so, we've seen 3 vaccines, 1 for classical swine fever and 2 for poultry diseases, for Newcastle disease and infectious laryngotracheitis. So there's a lot of progress being made. European Union has a positive environment for authorising veterinary vaccines. And just one other thing to note, which you might be of interest, in April this year, the Cvmp granted an opinion for the first DNA plasmid vaccine in the European Union for salmon pancreas disease vaccine in Atlantic salmon. So again, we can see a lot of technologies coming through the European Medicines Agency, and there's a lot of interest now in very novel therapies, including stem cell products and monoclonals. So if we move on to what sort of requirements do we need to authorise a veterinary vaccine, we're going to use the example of a live FMD vaccine to try and shorten the presentation. But I think when people ask us, and we have many meetings, what do we need to do, we often turn it around and say, what are you trying to achieve? And there's a famous advert in the UK which my old chief executive used to say, does it do what it says on the tin? I'm not sure if that's a European phrase as well, but does it do what it says? If it doesn't do what it's in, it's not going to be authorised. You have to generate the data to back up your claims that you intend to put on the product information, or what we term the summary of product characteristics, or the SPC. So it's the applicant's responsibility to justify their authorisation. And you need to think about what you're trying to claim. Are you trying to prevent or reduce infection? Are you trying to make a claim about improved production, improve weight gain, food conversion efficiency, or prevent or reduce transmission of FMD to in-contact animals. And if you are going to vaccinate young animals, what is your claim for overcoming the possible influence of maternally-derived antibody? It's things you need to think about when you're at that development stage about your product. And again, for FMD, it's really difficult. Not only you've got a hypervariable virus, you've got a broad species range. So what are you going to try and protect? Are you going to try and protect cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, etc.? Because for each species you choose, you will have to do a complete package of safety and efficacy data for each of those species and each route of administration. So if you want to offer intramuscular, subcutaneous, or maybe for recombinant oral, you have to do the safety and efficacy studies for each of those routes of administration. So think carefully before you throw yourself into a whole array of different scenarios, because define your product, define your route of administration, and then go with that, because that is going to be challenging enough as it is without trying to broaden it too much. And also, when you come to your actual product, are you aiming for a single product with maybe a single strain of stereotype, or are you going to take advantage of the EU systems now, which enables you to have a flexible combination of strains within one authorisation, where you can then match the strain or strains according to the epidemiological situation? So you can match your vaccine strain as far as possible with the strain circulating in the field at the time of formulation. And then you've got to consider whether you want to do with your live recombinant a monovalent or multivalent, because if you're going to choose a multivalent, you've got to think very carefully about the design of your safety studies to make sure that you look at the worst case scenario situation. And then for your vaccination schedule, you have to follow the vaccination you intend to use. So if it's going to be a single dose, then it has to be a single dose throughout the dossier to demonstrate the efficacy. If you're going to do a prime and boost, you've got to show that schedule and also show the efficacy of a single booster if that's your intention. And the other issue you need to consider, if you're making a DIVA claim, how are you going to address that? And furthermore, when it comes to the practicalities of wanting to use your new EuFMD vaccine with other vaccines a farmer or a vet may want to use at the time of vaccination, have you demonstrated the compatibility? Because that's important, because the regulators want to see that, because you can't just throw several vaccines to an animal without showing there is an inhibition of the immune response in that situation. So for those who are actually trying to develop a new veterinary vaccine, you've got to be aware of the regulations. I've just put the really key ones there. For a live recombinant FMD vaccine, you would have to follow the regulation 726, which is the European Medicines Agency route. It's called a centralised route, and any recombinant product will have to go through our agency. Interestingly, for a conventional FMD vaccine, it's optional. You could go through a member state, or you come through the EMEA. The technical requirements are laid down in 2001-18, but for a live FMD recombinant vaccine, you would have to also consider the technical requirements laid down in the annexes of that directive on deliberate release into the environment. And finally, and it's still very important, whenever you're administering a pharmaceutical product or a vaccine to a food-producing animal, you need to consider the potential residues in that food-produced animal and that they're safe for consumers of meat and dairy products. And you can't put anything into your product which isn't within that regulation. There's a table in 37/2000 will list all the approved substances. Or you've got to approach the EMEA and get it out of scope. And that's what some people do on the veterinary vaccine to remove the studies that are required to address the residue situation. And this again just lists the various technical requirements. All veterinary vaccines will have to comply with the European Pharmacopoeia. interestingly, for foot and mouth, the only monograph is for conventional inactivated vaccines. The question you might ask me, does that apply to my new live recombinant vaccine? No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't, but it would be a little bit probably foolish to ignore a lot of the requirements, especially the immunogenicity requirements, which are in that monograph. So it's there because it would be a guidance for you for that new recombinant vaccine. And then it's really important to understand the safety and efficacy requirements, where I come on in a little bit, if we have time, just to talk about that. But they're, again, laid down very clearly in chapters in the Pharmacopoeia. They're very short chapters, but they hold a lot of information on how you must design your studies. And then in addition to those mandatory requirements, the European CvmP is obligatory mandatory requirements. There are various Cvmp guidelines were produced by the Immunological Working Party, which again are relevant to foot and mouth disease vaccines. And again, I list them there. Again, the one for the multi-strain dossier currently is only for inactivated vaccines, but again, there may be a possibility to look at the way you could incorporate several strains of a new recombinant into a multi-strain dossier. And then if your organism is a GMO, and this is where we get a lot of questions because there's some confusion over the directives, also because there's similar numericals. 2001/18 is the deliberate release directive. If you were doing a field trial with your new recombinant, you wouldn't come to the European Medicines Agency. You would go to the national competent authority in the member state to get an authorization. Now, with FMD, it's a special case because vaccination against FMD is prohibited under the FMD directive, 2003/85, I think, but it's prohibited. So all the products that have been authorised, either at the national level or through the EMEA for FMD, don't normally include field studies. There's no requirement to that, and that is justified within the legislation. So what you would tend to do is then come straight to the EMEA for your authorisation with a GMO, and it's at that stage that we would then bring into the discussions and the assessment the GMO authorities, and that's unusual because normally the GMO authorities get the vaccine first through the field trials, but for FMD it's likely it would come to the European Medicines Agency first. And that, again, is just a summary, a flowchart of the way it works in practice, in that for a new recombinant veterinary vaccine coming to the EMEA, you have to submit a new Part 3E, which covers all the environmental risk assessment and data associated with that new GMO. And what are the objectives of the environmental risk assessment? Well, it's really important because it's a case-by-case risk assessment on the direct, indirect, short-term or long-term impact it might have, especially on human health, animal health and the environment. So therefore, you need to possibly consider additional studies to address those issues over and above the requirements that you would normally have to do to meet the requirements for marketing authorization. So just in the last few minutes, what I would just touch upon is what you would require to gain a marketing authorization for your new live vaccine. So the standard test that you require for any live vaccine, and again, just to emphasize that you must do it for each target species by each recommended route. They must be done to GLP, and it must be done at the maximum titer for release of that vaccine. And these are the key studies. The first one is a single dose and 10 times overdose. And again, those requirements have been harmonised relatively recently with Japan and the US under the VICH guidelines, they call it. So there's pretty standard requirements now for the three regions. But you, again, need to consider how you're going to do those studies. The first one is a single dose of your product. The next study would be a 10 times overdose. And if you're intending to have a 2-dose primary or a booster dose, you would need to do a repeat dose study as well. And the other big issue that you might face, again for FMD vaccines, when you want to cover really every animal in an infected area or a threatened area, is you may want to vaccinate all categories of animals, including the pregnant animals. And they are considered a special category, and again, you need to do specific studies. So for each species, you have to cover each trimester of pregnancy and each trimester pregnancy, and for each species. So that's 24 animals per species, and that's, if you think about doing pigs, cattle, sheep, that's a lot of studies. And again, as we mentioned before, field studies are not usually required for FMD vaccines, and they wouldn't be permitted in the EU unless there's a special derogation under the FMD directive. And some additional safety studies that you would be required to do for a live vaccine, and these are particularly relevant, and they also feed into the environmental risk assessment, is those ones for the spread of the vaccine strain, the dissemination in the animal, and also to reversion to virulence. They're the three critical studies. I won't go into the details of each study, but again, it would be important to establish the safety of that new GMO through those studies and feed those in to your environmental risk assessment, because people want to know what the impact might be in terms of the survivability of the environment, the ability to spread to target or non-target species, the ability to affect man. It's all those issues, and those studies normally demonstrate the safety of that recombinant. So this is the penultimate slide, and it covers the efficacy. And again, as with safety, you need to consider the efficacy studies, and they have to be done, again, at the minimum titer in each recommended species using the recommended route of vaccination. And you need to establish both the onset of immunity and the duration of immunity. Again, how you would do that with a new recombinant is a little bit for the applicant to justify, but again, as I mentioned before, you would have to take probably some guidance from the monograph which demonstrates the immunogenicity either through a challenge test at 21 days, either using the traditional PD50 or the new possibility of using the protection, the PGG test, which has recently been introduced into the monograph. And then once you've established the duration of immunity, you also need to consider the efficacy of a booster if you're intending to revaccinate animals. And the final one is to mention, because there's now a vaccination to live policy, previously people didn't tend to worry about MDA, you might need to consider if there is an ongoing vaccination scheme in a certain territory, the influence of MDA. So that's the basic presentation. Again, for those who are interested in getting more information, there are two possibilities through the European Medicines Agency. We've set up an innovation task force where you can actually seek scientific or legal or regulatory advice well before you intend to submit a product, and the details there are on the slide and including the email address. And there's also a more formal route which companies tend to use prior to submission application, where they get formal scientific advice on the development studies before they submit their application, in the expectation if they address all the recommendations from the Scientific Advice Working Party, they should get a relatively smooth run for their application for approval. So I think that's it. If there's any questions, I'll be happy to address them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin, and it was very instructive. I hope people still have the courage to go on with the vaccine research. But please don't be afraid. Ask questions if you want. So is there anyone who has a question? Yes, there in the back.
thank you very much for the presentation. My question is, how would the agency treat a vaccine that was previously registered in other countries?
Well, again, the European legislation is clear and the requirements laid down in the directive and technical annexes of those directives, and it's for the applicant to address them. For products authorised in other countries, they wouldn't be relevant for the legal provisions for granting that authorisation, but they could be potentially supportive if they're put into the dossier. So what you may see is that they may show some laboratory and field studies in other regions, but again, they're not normally the critical studies which have to be addressed according to European legislation. What we're seeing now with this, what I mentioned, the international agreement on safety studies, those safety studies which have been, performed to support the registration in, say, the US or Japan, should be relevant for the authorisation in the European Union. So they should be relevant and would be classed as the critical studies, but normally the studies that are seen are normally only very supportive.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I think we have to conclude this presentation because we come to the break, but before, so we have some announcements, but before that I want to thank you again for coming and to give us a